Comrades, when Karl Marx was writing Das Kapital, the biggest group of workers in Britain were domestic servants. Karl Marx didn't expect domestic servants to make the revolution in Britain or anywhere else, even though they were the most numerous group. The second biggest group in Britain were farm labourers. And of course, there's a heroic story of the struggle of farm labourers, the top little martyrs, to unionise, which failed. And Marx didn't expect them to actually lead the revolution either. One way of looking at neoliberalism, I suppose, is to think of it as the way in which capital was trying to reduce workers to conditions of being like domestic servants and farm labourers. That is, people who are not in a very good position to fight back and to struggle against the system. Okay? Okay. So, have they succeeded in doing that? And I think up to a point they have, but they've also created new forms of labour, new forms of work, new types of factory, new types of social organisation, which do give us the possibilities of fighting back. Now, I'm in the usual position of having to start off by issuing a series of denials about what I'm supposed to believe. I don't believe that the working class has vanished. I don't believe the working class is no longer a force for revolutionary change in society. I don't think we should dissolve the party into a series of movements. I don't think that public sector workers, of whom I am one, are a bunch of parasitic labour aristocrats living off the rest of the working class. I don't think we should cease to organise public sector workers, and so on. Now, I think it's important if you're having a debate to actually focus on people who really think, rather than a bunch of straw men, and some of these have been elected over the last couple of days. So, with that starting point, let me just say that there's a thing I would like to begin with, which I mentioned in the article, which is what Bertolt Brecht said to Walter Benjamin, which is, don't take your cue from the good old things, start from the bad new ones. So let's start from the Amazon packing factories, let's start from the freezers in Asda, and let's start from the call centres, which is where the working class is beginning to be reconstituted and where it's going to be put. I think the real essence of the IS tradition, which quite a lot has been said recently, is beyond the individual things like state capitalism, which are all very important. It's the ability to look unpleasant facts in the face, to face reality, and see the way things have changed in the world and in the class. That's always been our strength. It seems to me, if we're going to face up to what neoliberalism has done, we have to continue with that aspect of what we're doing. So what is neoliberalism? Now clearly, not every single thing that's happened in the world in the last 40 years can be ascribed to neoliberalism, the whole geopolitical situation, imperialism and so on can't. But a lot of things, I think it nicely sums up an entire era, an epoch, in the same way as we think about the period from 1945 to 1973 as an era. I think we have to think of the period from 1973 onwards as itself constituting a kind of era in the history of capitalism. Now, I don't want to go through the origins theoretically of the neoliberal approach on Hayek, Friedman and all these people, because I don't believe in the Naomi Klein conspiracy theory of history. These people had this great plan and the corporations wanted it and they were just waiting for some disasters to apply it. That isn't what happened. People would have ignored von Hayek and Milton Friedman if certain things had not occurred towards the end of the 1960s and the beginning of the 1970s. Two things in particular. One was an outgrowth of the post-war boom itself and the increased process of globalising capital, in which large corporations actually became quite small in relation to the system as a whole. And they began to want the same kind of things that small businesses have tended to want. Less taxation, get deregulation off our backs, remove the power of the trade unions. So even without a crisis, by the end of the late 60s, big corporations, small corporations were beginning to demand this kind of thing of the state. But what really sealed the deal, if you like, was the return of the financial and economic crisis in 1973-74. Now, it wasn't wage rates that actually caused the crisis. It wasn't because workers were getting very high wages. That didn't cause it, contrary to an argument that was put at the time by the late Andrew Glynn and his associates. But it was the fact that capital came to the conclusion that too much, as you like, was going to labour in the form of wages and in the social wage, and that had to be reduced and then to go to capital instead. And to do this, they required what I call a regime of reorientation, and this in this country was led by Margaret Thatcher, a tremendous class fighter, to whom I think we should show a degree of respect for leading her class in a way that the useless leaders of our side did not do. And if we had people of her calibre who might have actually won some victories in the 1980s, she was a great strategic thinker and people ran about her similarly. And Reagan was a glove puppet, but she wasn't. It was necessary for someone like that to wage the class war in the late 70s and early 80s to win the victories that capital required. And she did it in three ways. Or her class that she was leading did it in three ways. One was to introduce very high unemployment rates and permanently high unemployment for a long period of time by raising interest rates, by refusing to subsidise failing industries and so on. unemployment was disastrous, and there were some areas in northern England, in central Scotland and Wales have still not recovered from this. And of course the point was to terrify people into not taking strike action. The full horror of what happened when you went to the job centre, the humiliation, the intimidation, which of course is much, much worse now. But even then, this was the kind of way of terrifying people of what unemployment meant. That was one thing. The second thing was to launch a strategic attack on important trade unions, not all of them, and not with the intention of smashing the trade union movement. In fact, in one sense, they require a trade union movement or bureaucracy to do certain things, but to actually teach the trade unions a lesson. This was done by attacking principally the miners in 1984 and print workers 2 years later, and private sectors. And those defeats, in a sense, sealed the initial victories of neoliberalism. Not, as I say, because they smashed the unions, but because they terrified the bureaucracy, especially faced with a barrage of laws that were introduced in 1980 onwards, made them frightened of taking any kind of action, solid action, but even actually to support their own members. This was an important thing. The third thing was a kind of more molecular process of capital reorganisation, of actually shifting where capital was to different parts of the country. Now, the problem, there's a kind of widely believed fantasy that sort of jobs are leaching out of Britain and the West more generally to go to the global south. This isn't true, actually. There are some jobs that have done that, but that's not by and large what the case has been. What has happened is that jobs have moved within the great metropolitan centres of the West. So, in Britain, the M4 corridor in England, and Silicon Valley in Scotland, in America, the shift of jobs from the Rust Belt in the north down to the deep south, to move to non-unionised greenfield kind of site areas to build new plant where people there are no unions and often using illegal labour, something in America. This was the third thing. It took a longer process for this to take place. And then what happened at the end of that, of course, was people moved back into the original deindustrialised areas and set up new plant, new factories, new offices there on the basis of the fact that workers had been defeated. Glasgow was almost entirely deindustrialised between about the mid-70s and the late 80s. Extraordinarily quick when it finally came. Now 1 person in 10 in the greater Glasgow area works in a call centre. This is much, much more than ever worked in engineering in the great days of the Red Clyde. And apart from the NHS, that's the biggest employer, right? That's the new shape of the labour force in that part of Scotland. At any rate, that's parts of England where it's exactly the same. Now, the effect of these three things was twofold. On the one hand, it meant that when the economy did begin to recover, which it did in 1982 and continued, it was stops and starts right up until 2007 and the second crisis, it meant that workers were in a weakened condition to take advantage of the fact that the economy was recovering. Whereas in the Great Boom, the strength of the trade union movement and so on meant people were able to fight for higher wages in a fairly consistent way. The weakness or the weakening of the trade union movement meant that they were not able to benefit from it. So you had a boom of sorts, but not one that benefited most of the working class. In other words, it didn't look like the Great Boom, but it was nevertheless still a boom. The second thing that the effect of these three strategies was to do was to drive social democracy rightwards in a fairly extreme kind of way, and with the result being Blair. And of course Thatcher once said that she thought her greatest achievement was Tony Blair, the actual driving of the Labour Party to its most extreme right-wing positions ever since, at least since the early 1930s, and I think in a more permanent way. However, this doesn't mean that neoliberalism swept all before it. Clearly the last great victory the working class of this country has achieved was the poll tax struggle in the late 80s and in 1990, which inadvertently got rid of Thatcher. And that showed, in a sense, the limits of the original vanguardist and neoliberal strategy she pursued. What we get from this point, from 97 in Britain, slightly earlier in America with Clinton, is what we tend to call social neoliberalism, borrowing a term from Perry Anderson, a regime of consolidation. That's to say, they've done the initial dirty work, the initial rollback between unionism and aspects of the welfare state. Now we have to kind of consolidate that. And what this was done, and it's quite interesting, was to actually maintain the same economic order, but actually to ameliorate this with all sorts of social liberal attitudes. We like gay people, we're opposed to homophobia, we're against racism. But, by the way, we still believe in inequality as established by the neoliberal order. And that, of course, was very important in winning, if you like, the support of the what you might call the liberal new middle class, the people who work in the public sector, who are in creative industries and so on, who thought that Thatcher was so terribly vulgar, and who didn't like the racism and sexism and homophobia of the neoconservative element of vanguard neoliberalism. They were won over, in a sense, by the idea that it was okay to like this system because they brought all these other social benefits with it. Never forget just how deeply some people in the middle class actually hate working class people. Even now, if you read The Guardian, you get references back to the trade union barons of the 70s who were crushed, and now we have the banking barons, as if these were equivalents. And this is a classically middle class kind of position. So it was important to win them over. Now, what that happened in the course of this was that there's a kind of three very distorted images of the working class began to emerge. One is the one that Owen Jones has reminded us of, the notion of the chav, the Ned in Scotland, the kind of drug-taking, drinking slobs who live in peripheral estates and don't work and live off the welfare system. This is one image. And of course that's been mobilised for the cuts in welfare that are currently taking place. However, there are two other ones just as important. One, ideological images. One is the image of the heroic white working class, the last dying vestiges of the industrial working class who are now under pressure from fiendish Polish, Romanian and Bulgarian workers who are taking their jobs. This is the white worker, you know, the notion that was mobilised, of course, 2-3 years ago by Gordon Brown, a dying race, noble, heroic, but going, you know, as opposed to the slobby, scummy chavs. And then there's a third image, and that's the image of the greedy public sector worker. And I think, of course, this is one reason why we shouldn't entertain any conceptions that public sector workers are some kind of labour aristocracy, because it plays entirely into the hands of a narrative which suggests that they are people who are living off the state in some kind of, and are taxpayers in a parasitic kind of way. So these are the images. What's the reality? Well, it's not true that British manufacturing has collapsed. Or that Britain has become entirely an economy based on services. It's a massive exaggeration, a superficial one. Neither is it true that everyone is being reduced to, as it were, short-term contracts. This is the argument, I think, against the precariat argument, although I believe I was accused of believing this at a meeting earlier today. It's not true. I mean, actually, most people have long-term contracts and permanent contracts. But that doesn't mean that everything's marvellous in the workplace. For one thing, the regimes of assessment, of annual reporting, of objectives and all the rest of it are meant to keep workers in a state of permanent trepidation on whether they're achieving, you know, the kind of goals that have been set for them by their managers and so on. This is something that didn't exist in anything like the same kind of way 30 years ago, but now it's the routine way in which people are treated. And that's accompanied with a regime of de-skilling. I mean, other lecturers, in the last few areas of the academic life where you have some control over the labour process, but even for us, that's being attacked with standardised kind of things we have to teach, with all sorts of stuff being put online, so they don't require us to actually physically be there to teach it and so on. This is the general drive towards taking people's remaining skills away from them and to make them replaceable as units. Now, when we're talking about, I can see that. Okay, so I think we need to see that it isn't just what's happening at the level of the workplace that is important. There's also what you might call the kind of way of life of the working class that's been affected by neoliberalism. And sometimes just by other changes in technology have taken place concurrently with it. I was born in 1957 in a NHS hospital. We lived in a council flat that was built and run by them. My father worked as a radiographer in an NHS hospital and was a member of NALGO. My grandfather was an engineer, worked for the council on the trams. He belonged to D&G. My mother, the only person in the family who worked for a private employer, worked for the bank, was a member of BIFU, for whom she was a shop steward, a rep, I think they called them. We shopped at the Cooperative Society, who also delivered our coal. We went to school in a public-owned bus. We visited our relatives in a state-owned train. We were educated at state schools, and I didn't go to university when I started work. I also worked for the NHS and joined NALGO. In other words, there's a kind of collective way of life which people existed right through to the 1970s, which has been almost completely wiped out in the way in which it was understood. And that comes with consequences. It comes with consequences to people's consciousness, how they think of themselves as workers, and how they think of themselves as people with social democratic kind of views. These things don't just emerge automatically by the fact of being in a workplace. They actually come through struggle, often mostly they come from being in trade unions. And here the unfortunate fact is, though, that most people in this country are not in a trade union. And particularly, people in the private sector, only 14% or so of the workforce is actually unionised. Now, so these are in strategically important places and could actually cause havoc if they actually took strike action. And that's true, and it's important to understand that. But for 85% of them have not to have gone through the experience of actually being in a union, and the development of a certain kind of class consciousness, a social democratic consciousness that comes with that, is extremely important, because it has to be overcome at some point. And it won't be overcome by the Labour Party. Now, I think in some cases we often, how can I phrase this, are too critical of the Labour Party. I think it stems this from Miliband Senior's excellent, in some ways, book 1961. There's a narrative that we've taken up. It's the same in Cliff and Donnie's book. about the Labour Party. In essence, we're so keen on the narrative of betrayal, which is all true, of course, that we actually ignore the achievements of the Labour Party, the NHS, the Equal Pay Act, the Health and Safety at Work Act, the Wheatley's housing, council housing in the 1920s and so on. That's why people voted for it, because it actually did things. It created a kind of institution, a set of institutions and practices in society that actually made things better for working class people. People aren't idiots, they didn't vote for the Labour Party for no reason. They did it because it did things, but most of these things are now historical. They're not things they've done recently. Think of any great reforms Labour Party's brought in, minimum wage, maybe a few other things, but there's nothing very much. And this does have effects. But it wasn't just that, it was also that Labour actually instilled a kind of class consciousness in people, a very restricted kind, but it helped nurture it and foster it and help people think of themselves being certain kind of class ways. That doesn't happen. Whenever people still vote for the Labour Party, but actually it doesn't do those kind of things any longer in that kind of way. And that again is a problem for us, because we assume a certain shared set of values of people. We go and speak to reformist workers, we try to persuade them to be revolutionaries, but we assume that certain things we all agree about that we can start a conversation about. Actually, in a lot of cases that isn't necessarily the case, because they haven't been through the kind of experiences that allow them to develop those kind of views. So this is a problem. However, it's a double-sided thing. On the one hand, Labour, as I say, and the absence of trade unionism in many people's lives means that certain kinds of consciousness are not produced as part of daily experience. But on the other hand, it also means the kind of restrictive elements, the kind of restraining hand of trade union bureaucracy and of Labour politicians is also weakened, which means in the incredibly volatile situation that we are in, we are going to see all sorts of social explosions. And one of the, I suppose, the benefits of what I've just described is that this will not necessarily be ruled and kind of controlled in the same way as they might have been 10, 20 or so years ago. So I think we have to see that we can't predict where certain kinds of struggle are going to come from. No one actually predicted the poll tax would pan out the way it did back in 1990, or that it would be won almost entirely by community struggle and by rioting, rather than by trade unionism. But that's been the pattern of most of the big social struggles that have taken place since then. That doesn't mean there isn't going to be big trade union struggles, and there will be, but it means that we can't predict the kind of stuff. It's not a steady pattern. The kind of normal rhythms of working class life that used to exist back in the 50s and 60s and 70s aren't there any longer, and because of the way in which the economy has been, and society has been changed. I just want to conclude by, I think, we have two ways in which we can do this, and we can participate in this. Now, there is truly a crisis of representation, of electoral representation of the working class, and none of the various things that have been put forward to deal with that seem to me to be adequate. But we clearly believe, because we involved ourselves in Respect and we involved ourselves in the Scottish Socialist Party, and whatever disasters happened in both those cases, nevertheless we thought it was right to do that. Not to dissolve the Revolutionary Party, but to participate as a Revolutionary Party in some kind of electoral project that gives people something to vote for. Now, I think we cannot carry on allowing other forces to establish these kind of electoral alliances and parties, and for us to come along later on and try and get involved in them if they'll let us. I think we have to say what we want, what we think this kind of formation would be like, what would be prepared to involve ourselves in, how could we kick-start it, and who would be involved in doing it. Otherwise we'll always be catching up with what other people have done and not necessarily being able to shape that. Right? The other thing, and here I go back to the point about the private sector. I generally oppose useless historical analogies. Mostly they're not very, very good at all. However, in this case, there are two that are quite useful for us, and that's the experience of the new unionism in the 1880s, and even more so, the question of unionisation in the 1930s in this country and in America. But in both these cases, it was socialists who actually got involved in the unionisation campaigns of previously non-unionised areas, and a very impressive groups of women, particularly in the 1880s and crucially against the dockers. But in America, auto, rubber, in this country, aerospace, and so on. And it was the Communist Party that did this. In some cases it was Trotskyists who did it. In some cases it was mad Christian socialists called the Mustyites who did it in America. Whoever was around and could organise, did organise. Now I think we have to think about this. It's not that I think that there's something wrong with us focusing on public sector trade unions. We have to continue to where we have areas of strength, but we can't stay entrenched in them. We have to move out. The bureaucracy will not do it unless they're absolutely pushed. So I think some question we have to address is how can we, working in conjunction with the lower levels of bureaucracy, actually think about unionisation campaigns in the private sector. If we don't win that, and we don't unionise these areas, we cannot win any significant complete social victories. That cannot be won simply by teachers and lecturers and civil servants. So I think these are the challenges and some of the issues before us. The question that someone said to me earlier on is not, has neoliberalism changed the working classes? How has it changed the working class? Well, it's changed it in many ways. Some of them are dangerous to us, but some offer some opportunities, and that's the kind of thing I'm trying to focus on. Thanks.
My book is much smaller than Neil's, but it's also cheaper. Let me start by saying that Neil offers us three ways in his article of looking at the changes to the working class. The first is to assert that nothing has changed. Now, I've never met one of these slightly strange dogmatists who says that nothing has changed in the last 40 years. I think actually that is a bit of a straw man argument here. But I want to look at the two other approaches that Neil offers to dealing with the changes to the working class in recent decades. The first way of looking at it is to say that there's been a more or less fundamental transformation of the social relations of production. That the basic relations between classes under capitalism have been transformed in a way equivalent to the transformation of feudalism and the rise of capitalism. There are many examples. Hart and Negri write in similar terms. Many autonomists argue in similar terms that there's been a fundamental transformation. Let me just pick the weakest version of this argument, which is Guy Standing, who wrote probably the worst book I've ever read, which is well, one of the worst books I've ever read, I probably have read worse, called The Precariat, the New Dangerous Class. And what Standing does is he develops this notion of a new dangerous class by lumping together quite disparate groups. So we have those who find themselves in temporary employment, those in part-time employment, the growing army in call centres, interns, people in export processing zones in Malaysia, at one point the entire Chinese working class, and most bizarrely of all, those who are dependent on others for allocating them to tasks over which they have little control. I don't know if that applies to anyone in this room who's ever been allocated a task at work over which they have little control. This is a nonsensical way of looking at class and the transformation of the last 40 years. Nonetheless, we have to be honest that this has established itself in many ways as a new common sense in large sections of the left. And I think for that very reason, although myself and Neil both reject that way of understanding it, there's nothing at all dogmatic about saying that the basic social relations of production have remained the same. That we have a capitalist minority that depend for their livelihoods and for running society on the labour of the great majority who are drawn together in collective workplaces, who are exploited, and because of that have power and a power to transform capitalism. We have to start from that basic insight, and then we have to talk about the changes, which are changes at the level not of the basic social relations of production, but in terms of the social division of labour, how the workplace is organised, and so on and so forth. Okay, now, what then are the changes that have taken place in the recent period? The most obvious change, which Neil mentioned, is the decline of manufacturing industry in countries such as Britain. I think it's important to say this is not a feature of neoliberalism. This is a much longer trend within the history of capitalism. Manufacturing employment peaked in Britain in 1911. 1911 it reached 40%. Still less than half of the labour force, and still lower in 1911 than the service sector. For most of the subsequent period, manufacturing employment has declined. There was a brief period in the run-up to the Second World War and immediately afterwards where it didn't. But since '61, it's declined steadily. And the main reason it declines is the reason that Marx offered. That as labour becomes more productive for utilising machinery and technology, you can generate the same output with lower levels of employment. Manufacturing output has stayed pretty much the same, but the number of people employed to generate that output has diminished massively over the course of the last century or so. One implication of that, of course, is that the quite large numbers of people who do remain in manufacturing are tremendously powerful. Particularly true in areas like car manufacturing, the aeronautics industry and so on, where production tends to be organised according to so-called just-in-time production methods across quite large production networks. And it means that small, quite strategically located groups of workers can shut down production lines over very, very large geographical areas. 2001, there was a dispute in Ford in Dagenham, enormous anger among the workforce and so on. One of the things the workers told us was that the engine plant at Ford Dagenham, if it closed down, could shut down Ford's entire van manufacturing network across the entirety of Europe in a single day. Enormous power concentrated in these kind of areas. The reason they didn't exercise that power in 2001 had much more to do with the union bureaucracy and the low level of workers to challenge it, not the objective power of that group. The second thing I want to say is, as manufacturing has declined, there's been growth of the other areas inside the working class. If you look at the UK workforce today, there's 4 giant areas of the labour force. The first, and by far the biggest, is these are broad groupings. The first and biggest is public administration, health and education. In other words, broadly the public sector. Something like 25% of the labour force in Britain fits into this group. The second biggest is distribution, hotels and restaurants. Those are the people who work in retail, warehouses, hotels, hospitality and so on. Third biggest group, which has grown enormously, banking, finance and insurance. It's about 1 in 6 workers. The fourth group, incidentally, is manufacturing. Manufacturing is just below banking, finance and insurance. It's still quite a large, broad occupational group. Now, these changes bring me to what I think my argument is with Neil on the structure of the working class, because Neil writes in his article, such growth as did take place in the heartlands of the system was based on investment in services rather than manufacturing or other productive sectors of the economy. Such new jobs as were created tended to be characterised by more insecure employment or underemployment. And I think there's 2 claims there what we have to look at very, very carefully. The first is that the bulk of the jobs growth is in the service sector or unproductive areas, as Neil puts it. And the second is these jobs are necessarily precarious jobs. Let me deal with those in turn. The first concerns what's productive and what's not. Marx draws the distinction. He says that actually being productive, and Neil is perfectly aware of this, is not about producing a tangible good or a service. The critical question is, do you produce a profit for the capitalist? And the workers in the warehouse at Amazon, thousands of people drawn into these huge warehouses, are definitely producing profits for the capitalist. Most of the jobs growth from the last 40 years has been in areas which generate profits, and the profits depend on the labour and the exploitation of large groups of workers below them. Even those jobs in finance and so on that don't directly generate profit, those jobs are absolutely vital if the people running those workplaces are going to grab some of the profits generated elsewhere in the system. You can't run a bank without bank workers, and if you don't have bank workers, you ain't going to generate any profit. The bulk of the jobs growth has been in areas which are in which labour is responsible for grabbing some of the profit or generating some of the profit in the capitalist system. Secondly, we should be aware of some of the myths about what the nature of these workplaces is. You look at one of the obvious things you can say about workplaces is how big are they? How big are the workplaces? And there's this myth that we live in a world of tiny entrepreneurial footloose enterprises. The reality is very different. If you look at the American economy, in 1980, 46% of workers were in workplaces over 100 employees. Today, it's about 45%. In other words, the size of workplaces have remained remarkably stable. And what's happened over the last 40 years is as manufacturing workplaces have tended to get smaller, so you've seen the rise of massive service sector workplaces in which workers are concentrated in huge numbers, and because of that concentration and pressure on them, have enormous power, potential power over the system. Related to this is the question of the public sector. And I'll be very careful what I say because I don't want to straw man Neil on this question. But I think it's very important to say that this has been a tremendous growth area in the last 30 or 40 years, and the question about how you reproduce labour power through the public sector has become a central preoccupation of the system. If you're a capitalist today, having an educated, trained, relatively healthy workforce is an absolutely critical concern, and the growth of the public sector in part reflects that concern. The proportion of the workforce with a degree has risen from less than 3% in 1970 to about 18% today. Given that about 50% of people leaving school now go to university, that proportion is very likely to rise in the period ahead. Doesn't necessarily mean that they use that degree in their job, but nonetheless, we have a relatively highly educated, relatively healthy workforce, and the role of the public sector in producing and securing that workforce is absolutely critical to the long-term interests of capital. Secondly, we have to be wary of the arguments of the likes of Zizek and so on. Again, this is not something Neil has said in his article, but I think it's important that there are people who put this argument that really the kind of strikes we saw in 2011 were, in the words of Zizek, the revolt of the salaried bourgeoisie. You public sector workers defending the privilege of the wage, the privilege of being exploited when the mass of people don't have this supposed privilege. The reality of work in the public sector is over the last 40 years, the main trend has not been the privilege of this group of people, it's been their proletarianisation. The reality is that if you look at life in the public sector, all of the kind of tools that have been used in the private sector historically to make you more productive, to make you work harder, and so on, have been transplanted into these areas. Conditions of labour for people in the public sector are increasingly the same as the experience of those in the private sector. And as this process has taken place, so there has been, because they're expanding areas, the retention of levels of organisation and a level of militancy in the public sector, which in many countries, not just in Britain, exceeds that in the private sector. Now, I think Neil will probably agree with many of his arguments, but nonetheless, I think he was very dismissive in his article of my argument that I made in a previous article, that these workers have real power. Neil says, is Joseph relying on the power of school teachers to disrupt society to bring down the system or something? Now, of course, I don't think a strike by public sector workers will lead to Soviets springing up and revolutionary transformation of capitalism and all the rest of it. That's not my position. But the reality is, in 2011, when 2.5 million public sector workers went on strike, it did cause tremendous disruption. Shutting down most of the schools in the country does cause tremendous disruption. When the bin workers in Brighton go on strike, it causes enormous disruption in Brighton. I think it's important to recognise this because the reality is, in 2011, the public sector workers could have won. Not that they could have brought down capitalism, but actually they could have struck a significant blow against the Tories' austerity programme. And we have to ask the question, not just do these workers have power, but what message does it send to the wider working class if groups of workers who are organised break through and win? The message that would drive through the working class is about the power of workers when you organise and when you fight. And this is why it's absolutely critical that we say, actually, we could have won in 2011, and were it not for the betrayals of the union leaders, we had every chance of winning in that struggle. I think that's a very important point to make. Because a radical minority in the public sector, of course, recognise this fact, we also have to talk about methods of drawing together that radical minority, giving them the organisational tools they need to begin to gain the confidence and organisation to put pressure on the rest. And so initiatives like Unite the Resistance and so on are also tremendously important as part of this picture. Let me turn now to the second bit of the argument about how precarious these jobs really are. You see, at one level it's useful to assert that there have been times in the past where people are in a much weaker and more precarious position. Neil mentioned domestic labour and farm labourers. I think in many ways that's all true, but I think in many ways the example of new unionism and so on is actually more significant because it shows not simply that there have been lots of people in a precarious position, but it shows that sometimes people in a precarious position can organise, they can fight in new ways, and they can break through and win. In general, historical terms, we should be optimistic about the capacity of these people to do that. But it's also true we have to make an honest assessment of how precarious we really are. Kevin Dugan, in his superb book, New Capitalism, goes through some of the arguments in depth. He was speaking earlier today, and I would heartily recommend that. But if you look at the argument that Kevin makes is that the labour market doesn't simply transmit changes in technology and so on and drive them through the working class. The labour market is also a powerful insulator of change. Capitalists have to try and retain labour, but changes can be slowed down and retarded by the labour market itself. And if you look at the labour market, one of the things you notice about it is its tremendous stability. If you look at temporary working throughout the 80s and 90s, it was fairly stable in Britain, about 5%. If you look at part-time working, it rose by about a quarter from 1984 to 1995, the beginning of the neoliberal period. But most of it was permanent employment in part-time jobs, school dinner ladies and so on, groups of workers who can actually organise and fight. If you look at other measures, if you look at the number of people holding jobs for a decade or more, this is the number of people holding those kind of jobs has risen over the preceding period. If you look at the total number of people who are in temporary jobs who wanted permanent jobs in 2007, it's 1.2% of the labour force. If you look at those who are in part-time jobs who want full-time jobs in 2007, it's 2.3% of the workforce. If you lump those two categories together, even after 5 years of crisis, it's 6% of the labour force. We can't generalise from the 6%, we have to generalise from the broader working class experience. Now, if that's true, why is it that we feel so tremendously precarious? Because the reality is that there's a massive disjuncture between the reality of what those statistics say and how lots of working class people feel. I think there's three elements to this. The first is that there are certain groups, Kevin in his meeting earlier today mentioned students, new graduates and so on, for whom actually conditions are extremely difficult. Graduate unemployment has risen enormously in Britain and so on. Secondly, something that I think Neil doesn't pay enough attention to is the ideology of neoliberalism has quite a strong hold in society. The notion that we're all precarious, that capitalism is this ever-changing, fast-changing system, that globalisation is an unstoppable force, these kind of ideas have become a sort of common sense in large sections of society. The third reason is a consequence of the kind of defeats that Neil is talking about, because the reality is that what you've seen over the last 30 years is more and more the discipline, the Taylorist techniques of scientific management being introduced in more and more areas of labour. The reality is, because we lost a series of battles, because our organisation has declined, we've been under the cosh, and because we're under the cosh, people feel powerless, under attack, and so on. It's important to get the order of the argument the right way round. It's not true that capitalism is restructured and therefore organisation becomes impossible. The point is, because we suffered defeats, they've been able to drive through attacks on sections of the working class, leaving us feeling vulnerable. But it doesn't objectively undermine our potential to organise and resist. Let me move to a close. 2 minutes, okay. See, finally, on the trade unions, I agree with Neil that there's a low level of union organisation by historical standards, and I agree that there's very low levels of confidence in much of the working class to fight. This is all true, but I think that's a very, very broadly accepted argument. It's been around for a long time, and I think everyone agrees on that. The question is, how will the situation change? And I think we have to avoid what I think is really a search for magic bullets. I think there is often an idea, because of the frustrations of the period, and it is a frustrating period, that there's something we can do in the working class that will transform the situation that we face. I'm very confident about the situation changing, but I'm not going to search for a magic bullet. I think we have to go back to something that Hal Draper argues in his book on class, where he talks about the way in which new forces in the working class periodically emerge, but they mature through an experience of struggle. It takes time and experience of struggle for the new sections of the working class to move to the forefront and fight. And I think we have to start from that understanding, precisely because I think that at the moment we're in a very, very long period of crisis. If you look at the period laid out ahead of us, I think we can talk about years, but even decades of crisis, of potentially the stagnation of the system and of pressure on working class life. I think if we start from an understanding that the objective situation of workers allows them to organise and fight, we can then begin to look at the areas in which struggles develop, intervene in them, organise them, and try to make sure that they win. But I think we should avoid a situation in which we look for some shortcut in this kind of process. Just to finish, there was a piece that Neil wrote recently, co-wrote with some other people, which made very sweeping claims about the working class, but it ended by saying, what we need to turn this round is systematic industrial work, republish Tony Cliff and Donny Gluckstein's book on Marxism and the general strike. We should hold trade union meetings. And I just think there's a huge gap between the sweeping claims that are made about the working class and what are actually very prosaic solutions to these kind of problems. I think our task ahead to finish is to look for opportunities to relate to new sections of the class are moving, to organise them, to try and give them confidence, but also to fight against some of the myths perpetuated about what neoliberalism has done to working class life.
Right, thanks. First of all, I'd really commend to you Neil's article on neoliberalism in the UK, which is in the ISJ, and I don't want to set him up as a straw man. I just really want to push the tantalising conclusions that he talked about precarity under neoliberalism. And I think there are three problems. Unfortunately, the idea of precarity and precarious workers in the outside world is not a straw man. It's very real, and it's something that we have to argue about. And the first thing to say is that there has always been precarity under capitalism. Capitalists try on the one hand to keep workers in order to make profits and use their skills, and on the other hand they want to drive down costs and exploit them. But secondly, accepting the idea that there is a precariat, a separate group of people, suggests that there is also a group of privileged workers with stable jobs and who are very complacent. Now, try telling that to the workers who've been sacked in FE, or the tens of thousands of workers who've been sacked in local authorities. There is no such thing as security under capitalism in jobs for anybody. But the main point that I want to make is that I don't think the idea of precarity is useful. I don't think it's useful for how we defend ourselves against the onslaught of our employment or against the insecurity that capitalism imposes. And I just want to take two very concrete examples, and they relate to something that Neil said about the public and the private sector. What we have to do is, rather than elevating the precariat to a separate class who perhaps need to organise separately, we have to look at its concrete forms. We have to look in the I'll finish quickly, the UCU, about how full-time and the vast majority of casualised workers can work together. Also, we've got a job to do in the public sector. There are 40% of people who still are not in trade unions in our sector. And secondly, just the point to finish on, I was in an inspiring meeting this morning with leaders from the CWU, from the Bakers Union, and those and Unite. All of those unions in the private sector have been highly successful in recruiting, organising migrant workers. And these are the examples that we need to look to. We can't look at the abstract, we have to look at concretely how we organise these workers and build a struggle against insecurity in that way.
Kevin will be followed by Pat Carmody.
Apologies to those who heard us in the last session. One of the points Neil makes in passing in his article in the ISJ, I think, is rash in the extreme. That capitalism is such a dynamic system, you can't imagine a crisis or series of crises lasting 40 years. I can. If you look at the current capitalist crisis, what marks it out from every previous crisis in the 30s, in the 70s, 80s and so forth, is the fact that there's no recovery. And the fact that there's no recovery means we're into a very, very prolonged period. I believe we're talking about a long war. A long war, relentless attacks on welfare, relentless attacks on the public sector. And the reason why I would stress that, it's not just to kind of cheer ourselves up or depress ourselves, is to recognise the reality. Because I think that some people have said, well look, we've had this huge crisis, these bad parties, and they've won on the pension strike, and they've won on tuition fees and so forth. The long war perspective, if you like, says it's not over in terms of pensions. It's not over in terms of tuition fees. These things, they won these rounds, but they'll come back again and again. If you look to America, a month ago, they taken a decision about raising the interest rates on the payments for student loans. Now, student loans in America are extraordinarily big. That's certainly possible in the years to come for us. The idea that somehow the pensions fight has been settled once and for all. They'll come back in terms of indexation, in terms of cuts to the whole thing. So we're talking about attacks that are relentless in their scale and in their programme. The idea that somehow we can make a judgment in 2012 or 2013 about how the crisis unfolded, I don't think that is realistic, and it gives you a fantastically pessimistic understanding of what has happened and what will happen. I think we are in a long war, and I think the responsibility of socialists to make sensible and patient explanations and interventions of this is important. Thanks.
Pat will be followed by Jim Wolfries.
Just to deal with this argument about precarity, and of course, that argument is definitely out there, not necessarily just in this room. Can you hear me okay? Is that better? I have to bend down, stoop. Just down the road from us, at SOAS, in around 2007 to 2008, the cleaners won the London Living Wage, they won union recognition, but the interesting thing about it was, in terms of the strategy around it, what did they do? They joined Unison, they joined with admin workers, with IT workers, with all those workers, but also linked up with people in UCU. They saw each other as their brothers and sisters in struggle. They didn't see that these were the kind of privileged workers or any of that salariat bollocks. And I think, we need to, actually, that's the kind of route forward for us. Also, I find it a bit strange that there's a kind of accusation, really, that the party and the party leadership doesn't take the private sector or private sector struggles very seriously. Let me just tell you, when I was in East London District, I was sent to the following disputes over a period of 12 months. A Dockers dispute, private company, Corrigan, private company, Remploid, kind of welfare state, Unilever, Ford's, Argos, the firefighters. Loads of common issues in terms of what the struggles are about, in terms of what the attacks were. Very, very common issues over pensions, attacks on pay, and attacks on people's conditions. And you see, I think, in terms of how we start to kind of rebuild a class, I think we've got a couple of opportunities that are coming up. The 29th of September, right? Demonstration outside the Tory Party conference, right? We want tens of thousands, 100,000 people on the streets of Manchester, we want coaches up there and all the rest of it, right? There is no reason on earth why activists, people in branches, can go to every single workplace, organised or unorganised, and get people on that coach. If you're not in a union, you should say, here's the leaflets, here's the union membership forms. Sign up to the union. We should be doing that kind of stuff. But actually, we need to ensure that our unions, we need to put pressure on our unions to do that kind of stuff as well. The other, very, very quickly, the other opportunity we're going to have is universal credit. I'm a part-time worker. I am going to be asked, right, what are you doing, Mr. Carmody? What are you doing to get, more hours and better pay? Well, I've joined a union. I'm going to put a motion to my next branch meeting to take strike action. But that's going to start hitting a lot of part-time workers where employers are getting subsidies from the state for the wage. So I'll tell you, there's an opportunity to put some pay fights there and organise the part-time workers that way. Thanks.
Thanks. Jim will be followed by Marnie Holbrook.
Yeah, I think there's a danger with a lot of the often very good critiques of neoliberalism that they have the effect of playing into the hands of the neoliberals themselves by exaggerating the economic impact of neoliberalism, which is often a very contradictory impact. So often critiques of neoliberalism that emphasize things like precarity can feed the notion that neoliberalism is this all-powerful economic system that is transforming working lives and that people won't have lifelong careers and so on. And that's why I think Kevin Dugan's book is very useful in nailing some of those myths. At the same time, I think that neoliberalism does have a very powerful ideological function, and so, as Kevin said in his meeting before this, precarity, the precariat may not be a useful term, but insecurity very much exists in the workplace, and I think we have to take on board both the manner in which those changes have taken place in the workplace and the implications for us, because there's been a systematic attempt in the public sector to introduce market mechanisms. The white paper on higher education talks about universities not being part of the public sector. University workers aren't public sector workers. They want to break those notions of collective solidarity. So all those mechanisms like performance management, introducing line managers, turning vice chancellors into CEOs, giving them big salaries, turning departments into cost centres, introducing an internal market, creates an environment that is more alienating for people and also subjects people to a process of scrutiny, control, monitoring, making them feel more atomised and powerless. Now, this is part of an age-old battle for control over the process of production. It's the kind of thing, in a different form, that Harry Braverman describes in Labour and Monopoly Capital, and I think its effects are contradictory, because as much as people can feel atomised, that it also creates a sense of us and them in the workplace, and it provides opportunities for socialists who engage with those processes, who acknowledge that they're real and try and undermine them, to give people confidence. And this means often very small things. You know, the workers at NASA and at Hewlett-Packard do things like bullshit bingo, where management jargon is crossed off on a card. So every time anyone says going forward or the strategic staircase or out of the box thinking and so on, they cross it off on a box. So I think it's that engagement with the lived experience of what's happening in the workplace that makes it easier for socialists, if they engage with it, to relate to broader political questions, and then that is also part of the process of building the struggles that Joseph was talking about.
Thank you. After Marnie, the speaker will be Charlie Hoare. I've got a couple of questions to put to the speakers. One, I think it's been put as a question from Ollie Vargas. Isn't the question how changes in the class affect our agitation and why we should be excited by new tactics like pop-up unions? And a question from Fergus Alexander: what do the speakers think the effect of secondary exploitation, such as mortgages, rents and so on, have had on the working class with the neoliberal attacks on welfare? Okay, Marnie.
Neil mentioned the gap between the images and the reality of Neil mentioned the gap between the images and reality of neoliberalism, and I think that's actually very, very important, because we can overstate both the power and the coherence of neoliberalism and try and come up with all sorts of specific questions to deal with that. And in his talk, he mentioned the changes that have happened in terms of regimes of assessment and the collective way of life that has been destroyed, that actually are not specifically unique. I don't think he was necessarily saying that, but it's important to remember that they're not unique to neoliberalism. It's not as if it's a new regime in that sense, as many of the left do talk about. For example, the regimes of assessment, and Joseph referred to it, Taylorism in the 1920s. These are not new things. You know, these are capitalism trying to gain extra surplus value out of us, and it will find its ways of doing it. In fact, Gramsci wrote at length in the 1920s about Fordism. So these aren't new. Secondly, the destruction of the collective way of life in terms of trade unionism and the number of people in trade unions. I'm in a job in Ireland which used to be a closed shop, 700 workers, We recently were no longer a closed shop, and we were expecting lots of people to leave the union. In fact, they didn't, because the tough times at the moment means that in the public sector, people aren't choosing, actually, to leave unions when they're in it. That's important. And also, in some places, we shouldn't be too mechanical about that. In France, for example, where they have lots of strikes, there's only 11% of people in unions. So in itself, it isn't going to determine the level of struggle. And because of that, I think sometimes it's more useful for us on the revolutionary left to talk about the neoliberal project, political project, that is riven with contradictions, because that opens up the space for us to actually get in there. For example, remember that based on market ideology, it is going through a massive crisis. The market has failed. It's going through a contradiction of saying that the state was meant to be sidelined when the state steps in and bolsters the banks, all of which focuses the political object of our attack. And that's important because the wishful thinking of neoliberalism doesn't actually correspond with reality. Capitalism has always been dependent on the state. In fact, as people have referred to, the public sector has grown during the neoliberal era. So these are lies, these are ideological lies. And when I think the term political project is useful, because sometimes if we just talk about it as an ideology, it's all swathing over us and somehow we accept it. If we understand that it's a political project on behalf of the capitalist class, it allows us to pick out the weaknesses there and exploit them and actually begin putting our arguments instead.
Charlie will be followed by Alexis Wearmouth, who will be the last speaker.
Joseph and Neil both talked about what happens here as being part of a much more general series of changes across the world economy. So I wanted just to sort of briefly go at the other extreme, talk about the most precarious working class in the world, which is the Chinese working class, where if you look to the specific studies of migrant workers, most migrant workers have had experience of the factory in which they work closing underneath them. Most migrant workers have had experience of not being paid. Significant minorities of migrant workers, and interestingly, the more recent the surveys, the numbers decline, have experience of physical abuse by managers and supervisors inside the workplace. When the crisis of 2008 hit, some 20 to 25 million workers, and no one, not including the Chinese government, knows whether it was 20 or 25 million. It's within that range. Some 20 to 25 million workers lost their jobs. So as factories closed down wholesale. So you have within that a sense of, because there is, as the last speaker said, there's no necessary correlation between trade union organisation and class struggle. There is no trade union organisation allowed in China, and nevertheless there is significant class struggle. One of the significant features that class struggle takes, however, is that I have yet to find a fight to keep a plant open. Okay, the fights are about getting paid off, getting paid in full, getting your money. They're not about keeping the plant open, and that does suggest that actually you do need to think, when the specific nature of people's working experience and lived working experience does mean that there are very specific ways in which you talk about how workers have to organise. Now in China at the moment there are a whole series of projects, mostly run by NGOs, about attempting to do some forms of organisation from outside. There are also organisations of people from the same village or the same county, which are essentially mutual societies. There are people who are attempting to take over branches of the state-run trade union. And clearly, we cannot look at that from outside and say, well, that's the one that's going to work, that's the one that's not going to work. Here too, I think we have to sort of say, when it comes to organising from the beginning,
can you sort of
where there is organisation can be built on. But actually, for a huge number of workers, the reality is there is no form of organisation, and actually, therefore, we need to think creatively about what form of organisation is going to fit for them.
Thank you. Another question for the speakers, if they haven't got enough. Can you talk about the impact of neoliberalism on the middle class? Alexis, you've got 2 minutes.
Okay, 3 points, comrades. First of all, I thought it was a bit unhelpful the way Joseph suggested that Neil's argument was characterising neoliberalism as significant a change as the transition from feudalism, one mode of production, to capitalism, another mode of production. Nowhere does Neil say that. However, there is a long tradition amongst Marxists about talking about different phases of capitalist development, which Neil refers to in his introduction to his article in the ISJ, and I think that's helpful. There's a recent book published, collection of chapters by a group of Marxists called Phases of Capitalist Development, in which Alice Kalinikos had a chapter discussing those concepts. Lenin placed quite a lot of emphasis on the importance of analysing a particular phase of capitalist development we were in when he talked about imperialism. So I think that can be helpful, and I think it came up in some of the contributions that were made in the discussion. So where Marnie talks about that Taylorism has existed since the 1930s, she's absolutely right. But the Taylorism takes specific forms in different phases of capitalism. It took one form in the 30s, it took a different form during the long boom of the 50s and 60s in return for pay rises. Today, it takes the kind of form that Jim Wolfrey's described in terms of the monitoring and etc. Just to wind up, I mean, Neil started his introduction by saying a list of things he didn't believe in order to inoculate himself from being straw-manned. Then Joseph and Jane said they specifically didn't want to straw-man him, then proceeded to kind of criticise him by implication by discussing the ideas of precarity of Zizek and Guy Standing. I don't think that's very helpful. I'd like to see them address the specific claims made in Neil's article, and I think that would be fruitful. I think, and I'll finish with this, that Neil makes specific claims about the need to address those areas that aren't unionised and the effects that's had on consciousness. We talked about the need to organise the young workers. Actually, they are predominantly going into those areas that aren't unionised. And he made also claims about the nature of reformism and the weakness of Labour, the Labour Party, as a result of neoliberal
Can you stop,
capitalism.
comrade?
And we need to discuss that.
Thank you, Neil.
Comrades, it's traditional at meetings of Marxism for the speakers to invite those people who are not members of the SWP to join the SWP. And I'd like to take part in that tradition by urging anyone here who isn't a member to join, not because we've presented here a complete, coherent set of agreed positions to you, but precisely because we haven't, because we're actually engaged in a debate. And I think that any organisation which doesn't have that happen is dead. We are alive because we are having it. That's a good thing, and I encourage you to join us in doing that. In response to Kevin Dugan, I was actually referring to the period in 1973 2007, Kevin, not the period that started in 2007. My argument was really with some arguments were made, I think even within the SWP, that somehow the crisis that erupted in 73-74 was the final one. There was no way out of it. There was just going to be a permanent semi-crisis from then on. And that was my argument. I actually tend to agree with you that we're engaged in a long crisis now, along a war of position and so on. But I think it's always a problem to say there's no way out of it, this is going to go on forever. I mean, I just think that's a really dangerous position to take. Capitalism is a system that ever evolves and changes. There'll be new forms of accumulation and so on will happen, even though I agree there's going to be continued attacks. Yes, I was a bit puzzled, since I don't actually think there is a precariat, why people insist on arguing as if I did. And I wasn't sure whether Jane was arguing that she thinks it doesn't exist, or it does exist and we should organise it with people already organised. I mean, I think we need a bit more clarity about this. Insecurity exists. And that is, I think, the key problem. That's not the same as precarity. And insofar as precarity does exist for 6% or so people who that affects, it's a situation in the labour market, it's not a class position. Right, so I think that's how we have to make the distinction in what it is. What I think is important about precarity, again, insofar as it exists, or insecurity, let's call it, is that what it now does is affect people in white-collar jobs, and even some sections of the middle class who we did not previously affect. And you might say that's why a lot of academics are actually talking about it at the minute. This was something always affected the working class, right, or most people in the working class, right down to World War II. The absence of insecurity was a product of the boom, and it come to an end with it, and now it affects people who would not have been in that position before. And that, in a sense, is also true with the regimes of assessment that Marnie talked about. These things are now affecting people in white-collar jobs who were not previously assessed by Taylorism and so on. And that doesn't mean most of these people aren't middle class, they're working class white-collar workers, but they were not previously affected by this thing. So that shift means there is a significant feeling that something new is happening, whereas in fact it's something that's quite old in relation to how capitalism works. I don't have time to discuss the complete effects on the middle class of neoliberalism, but I think it's extremely important that the class base of neoliberalism in both phases has drawn on different sections of the new middle class in particular. I will be developing this, I'm sure you'll be delighted to know, in a book on the subject, expanding the article, which won't be quite as big as that one, but we'll try and deal with some of the issues I haven't been able to deal with here. In terms of what somebody called secondary exploitation, I don't accept the term secondary exploitation, but clearly things like mortgages have a fairly important effect on making people cautious about taking certain kinds of action. It doesn't mean to be convinced by neoliberalism, but if you've got a bloody great debt hanging around your neck, then that makes people think twice sometimes about taking kinds of action that are necessary to win in certain situations. But that requires a great deal more discussion and time for here. One final thing. It seems to me there is a dispute coming up which embodies all of the problems we've been talking about and all of the opportunities, and that's the dispute over the Royal Mail and the privatisation of the Royal Mail. Actually, I'm surprised no one mentioned this, because this has got everything. It's got more privatisation of one of the last remaining areas that hasn't been privatised. It's got a question of a bureaucracy that's prepared to go to struggle to a certain extent over this and hasn't in previous strikes. It's one we can actually intervene and where we have got people. This seems to be the one area that's got the fulcrum of what's going to happen. Perhaps even more so than the bedroom tax, this struggle will actually define whether we're capable of pushing neoliberalism back or not. But as I say, I think that's something which we probably can all agree about, and also I urge anyone who isn't, again, a member of the party to join us and help us in that coming struggle.
Thank you. Over to Joseph.
Yeah, first of all, reply to Alexis. Alexis accuses me of characterising Neil's position as saying that neoliberalism is akin transition from feudalism to capitalism. I'm sorry, Alexis, I said the complete opposite. I said that wasn't Neil's position. This is a kind of meta straw manning going on here. Nonetheless, I make no apology for talking about the precariat, Zizek standing. We have to remember, you know, the main enemy is not in this room. The main enemy is guys standing. But in reality, we have to be clear that these arguments do actually have an impact on the workplace, and we have to, as well as debating among ourselves the nature of the changes, we have to take on and challenge some of this common sense that exists on the left. And so I make no apology for going through some very basic ABC arguments. There are ABC arguments we need to take up and use. Secondly, in terms of the kind of transformation of the workplace, I think Jim is right. If you look at the reality in the workplaces, for all the talk about moving from Fordism, you know, mass production based on Taylorist methods, to these new lean production or Toyotaism or what have you, the reality is for most people it's fairly traditional methods of controlling, supervising, putting pressure on labour that have been adopted across the working class. That's a reality, and it's part of the reason why people feel under the cosh, insecure, and all the rest of it. Thirdly, on the question of what someone called secondary exploitation, I think it's contradictory. On the one hand, the cost of losing your job if you have a mortgage can be tremendously high. Again, it's another reason why people might feel precarious and insecure, but it can cut both ways, because on the other hand, the burden of debt, the pressure on working class life from all these things can also push people to fight. It depends really how confident people feel, whether they're organised, the politics of the situation. It's not automatically one way or the other. Someone asked a question about pop-up unions. I mean, I think we have to be alive to the novelties in, you know, working class forms of struggle and so on. And I think if workers find a new way of doing things, I'm all for embracing it, taking it up, developing it across the class and so on. That's in a very fine tradition. It goes right back to the Soviet and so on. But I think we should be quite wary about this notion of the pop-up union representing such a development. For one thing, it wasn't something that came organically out of that struggle. It was something that groups of activists sought to impose on the dispute on Sussex. Secondly, for many of the people on the left who've taken it up, I think it reflects a profound pessimism in the capacity of workers to shift the existing unions. And I think if those groups do take it up and argue for it, it can become one more excuse to to step away from the existing unions rather than conducting a serious battle inside the public sector unions. And I think in the months ahead we do have a serious battle to fight. Let me just finish, I suppose, by saying that the period ahead is going to be one of intense class struggle. We don't know when workers are going to fight in Britain, but I have to say I'm relatively confident about the bitterness that exists in the working class, the absolutely intense bitterness at some point spilling over into struggles. We don't know whether dam will break first, we don't know if it will be in organised sections or the currently unorganised section of the working class. But we have to be both prepared to relate to those struggles, to take them up, develop them and learn from them, but also to challenge some of the myths and misconceptions inside the working class. And in doing so, this debate that we're having about neoliberalism is tremendously important. The debate and the argument that we're having will run and run, but we have to link arms, go out, unify, and try and fight to build and develop those struggles inside the working class.